There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am, I think it's a review, it's a quasi-review. It's some thoughts on this amazing Canadian novel, The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayr. It won the Giller Prize in 2022, and I think it was nominated for a bunch of other prizes. As I record this video, it has just made the shortlist for the inaugural 2023 Carol Shields Prize for Fiction by Women and Non-Binary Writers. So it has received lots of accolades, but as far as I could tell, it has not yet received a standalone review on BookTube. So I'm here to address that oversight as best I can. I absolutely love this novel. I wouldn't be surprised if this remained my favorite Canadian novel into infinity. I want to explain why I loved it, give you a little bit of an idea what it's about. And then at the end, give you some just kind of random thoughts, things to think about, things that I thought about as I was reading it, things that I didn't think about until afterwards, and things that I think that perhaps some readers who didn't get along with this book as much as I did, because it is somewhat of a Marmite book, I'd like to put some of those thoughts in their minds, because the more of the kind of adjacent issues and things that went through my little brain, the richer my experience of this book came while I was reading it and since I finished it a few weeks ago. Without further ado, The Sleeping Car Porter is set in 1929 and it's set on a cross-Canada, trans-Canada train. Is it the CPR? I think it's the CPR. Our protagonist is Baxter, and Baxter is a sleeping car porter. And if you know anything about it, I'm going to share a few things that I've learned because of reading this book and from a few minutes of other research about how awful it was to be a black sleeping car porter in North America in this era. And he is gay. He is a closeted gay man in 1929, and he's a black Canadian train porter working bone-crushing hours on cross-Canada trips, typically from Toronto or Montreal out to Vancouver or something like that. It's a grueling job, and he is doing it to save money to go to dentistry school. More on that in my kind of random thoughts at the end of the video. It is a very repetitive novel in that his duties are excruciatingly laborious, but also incredibly repetitive. He has to get down the sleeping car ready for the unruly, often drunk, certainly very demanding and horrifically white passengers. Get it ready for them at night and then put it up in the morning and shine their shoes and attend to every need and clean the toilets and you name it. It's described over and over again, and I think for certain readers that's a flaw in the book. It wasn't for me, but that's fine. People have different experiences. For me, it was, I couldn't get the sound of the train. I think it's described in the book, but I could certainly hear it as I was reading it, and this was his routine, and this is how he was scraping together enough money to go to dentistry school. More on that later. He is exhausted, and as the train makes its way across Canada, he becomes more and more exhausted to the point where he starts hallucinating. There's a point somewhere in the second half of the book where the train gets stuck. Something happens, there was I can't remember, but some natural disaster or something. So they were stuck for 45 hours, immobile. And that just makes the trip all that much longer. The life of a black train car porter was precarious, and that is dramatized very vividly here, in that it was so easy to get fired, and any little thing you did wrong or that a passenger accused you of doing wrong would result in demerit points, and after about 10 demerit points, you would be fired on the spot. And I think he's had 8. And so there's a lot riding on this, what he hopes will be his last cross-Canada trip, and he'll be able to pay his way through dentistry school. But if he screws up in any small way, or some asshole accuses him of screwing up, the whole thing might, the stakes are high. Maybe around halfway through the novel. Is it a spoiler? I didn't think of that. Let's see. No, it's on the back cover, so it's not a spoiler. Somewhere around the halfway point in the novel, when he's cleaning the toilet, he finds a pornographic photograph, this is 1929 Canada, of an interracial gay couple having sex. And he is completely aroused and horrified by finding this. He has no idea whether somebody planted it for him to find. If he keeps it and it's discovered on his person, he would automatically be fired, if not sent to prison. There was no human rights protection for gay men in 1929. I'll talk a little bit more about the social political issues at the end of the video, but he can't not keep it, so he keeps it in his breast pocket. And that, it feels like kind of a loaded gun. What's the Chekhov thing where there's a loaded gun in the first act? And meanwhile, we learn more about his life. He came from the Caribbean, I believe the Bahamas. There's a lot of childhood reminiscences and him being rejected for being a sissy by his mother, being raised by a really kindly aunt, and various past experiences and sexual experiences. The role of sex in Baxter's life is something that I really related to, that there was a lot of things in his life that weren't going well, but when he actually, and it didn't happen nearly often enough for such an attractive young 29-year-old, I think he was, black man back in the day, that it was just utterly transformative, and he would just explode in joy. And maybe explode is too much of a pun, I don't mean it that way, but the sex scenes are beautiful. I should say that Suzette Mayr is a queer author, lives in Calgary, and how fascinating to read a novel that had gay sex scenes that were so beautifully and realistically written by a lesbian writer. That was an exciting part of my reading process. I think I've described enough about the plot. The more exhausted he gets, the more hallucinatory the narrative gets, and, you know, he always has, and I think probably it was a way of surviving and also keeping track of people. He would create nicknames for every passenger that he was responsible for. But as the train trip progresses, his relationships or his impressions of and his interactions with certain passengers deepen. And especially when it's stuck for that extra 45 hours. And there's a particularly important relationship that develops between him and I think she's about 8 or 9-year-old girl who's grief-stricken, bereaved, and she latches on to him. That's all I'm going to say about that. I love the writing, and I was transfixed by the story. For me, this was a quintessentially yet countercultural Canadian novel, and that's why I loved it so much. So let me get into just some random thoughts, and you know, I don't have a very organized brain, but I've been thinking about a whole bunch of things. I'm just going to leave them with you to think about in connection with this novel. So it's set on the Trans-Canada Railway, the National Railroad. This was our racist founding prime minister's dream to link Eastern Canada with Western Canada, which was just consisted of British Columbia at the time of Confederation, but, you know, Saskatchewan and Alberta and blah, blah, blah. John A. Macdonald, he made this happen, this railroad, and it was a racist enterprise from beginning to end because of the way in which it contributed to and intensified the genocide that he and we, our ancestors, or the people that made our lives in Canada possible if we hadn't got ancestors going back that far, perpetrated on Indigenous peoples. The land was cleared, tribes were starved to death, forced into reservations, and the main purpose was get them the hell out of the way so the railroad can be built. And it was built, but I don't know enough to say that it was primarily built, but it certainly in large part was built with cheap Chinese labor, and then we treated the Chinese immigrants as horribly as you can imagine, because that's what Canada has been about from the first moment white people stepped on this land, is to oppress everyone else. So a novel that's set on a moving train across Canada, you cannot help but, or certainly for this particular reader, my experience of reading this book was deepened by thinking about that theme. The setting of this novel, the mode of transportation on which these events were unfolding, including Baxter's memories of other experiences when he actually had a life in a stationary setting, all of that was unfolding, well, the beautiful wilderness of Canada that we love to destroy is flashing by the windows. And while there's certainly no reference to Indigenous political or social issues in the novel, a Canadian reader should not be able to help thinking about that as we read the novel. That was a huge part of my reading experience. And there he is as a black man and as a queer man in 1929 with no rights, and the oppression of the sleeping car porters, the train porters who were predominantly black, that were shut out of unions and really treated as almost slave labor in the way that they were controlled and worked to the bone with absolutely no rights and paid nothing. I don't mean literally nothing, but I mean a pittance. So completely dependent on tips from the white passengers because no black people could afford to get on a train. I don't have historical scholarship to back that up. I don't need any. There might have been 2 people who were not white in Canada that could afford to go on a cross-Canada trip in 1929. And there's Baxter, hallucinating he's so exhausted, where he has little dreams that last as long as his eyes blink shut while he's walking through the trains, servicing everybody's needs. A story cannot be any more Canadian than that story. A queer black man on a train that was built for white settler Canadians to stomp all over this beautiful land that had been doing very well under the Indigenous peoples, thanks very much. And what Indigenous people we didn't kill, we pushed far away from the railroad tracks, and they are still suffering today from what we did and continue to do for decades and decades and decades and continue to do today. So all of that was bound up in my reading of The Sleeping Car Porter. Suzette Mayr has said about this novel that she wanted it to end on a moment of black queer joy. And it does. And that is so beautiful. And it's all the more beautiful the more I could keep this social, political, social, economic stuff in my mind as I got to that moment of black queer joy at the end. And then it didn't dawn on me until literally 30 minutes ago. And that's why I'm sitting here talking to my camera, because I finally got something else that just made the whole thing that much more poignant. Baxter claims in the novel that he's just about got enough money to save to go to dentist school and become a dentist. It was a dream. It was a mirage, his dream. The first black dentist in Canada, 1956. I'm relying on Google to tell me, and it appears that the first black dentist in Canada was a woman, Dory Marshall, who graduated in 1956. There was a black man who was a dentist on Salt Spring Island in what was then the colony of British Columbia, William Allen Jones, who was certified in 1886 but apparently had been practicing without any formal training, it seems, since about 1865. But that's the only one I found before 1956. And I'm assuming that people needing dentists on a small little island might not have a lot of choice, and that an exception was made in that particular little island. I don't know. But the bittersweetness of this novel is all the more intense for me because I really don't think he would have been able to become a dentist. He would not have been able to get accepted into a dentist school. When you look at the racial segregation that was in effect across Canada in 1929, it just adds a whole other layer of beautiful, angry sadness to my experience of this book. Now, again, maybe Suzette Mayr was creating a bit of a fantasy world where it might have been possible for him to go, but I actually think that this novel ending on a moment of black joy, of black queer joy, it's preceding a huge tragedy that he's about to experience, which is that he may have saved the money, but nobody's going to let him into their dentistry school. So, a really poignant, powerful novel. It's not for everybody. I don't understand why not everybody would love it. I absolutely adored it. And the more I thought about this array of issues surrounding it, it's impressing itself all the more deeply on me as a reader. I recommend it very highly. Thanks for watching.